All right, we're all set. So first of all, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you the panelists for joining us and everybody else who's in the audience. I'll do a quick introduction, then I'll introduce the panelists, and then each of them will have about 10 minutes to talk about their own work, their own research, and their thoughts about vaccination, public health, and a lot of the things that we're facing right now, and the equity dimensions of racial equity that we're facing again now and in the future. And then there'll be plenty of time for Q&A. That'll be sort of the second half of the event. You can either message me with comments, you can message AB as well. And if you have any problems with anything, can't hear people or whatever, AB or Josh can also answer those questions. And then in terms of Q&A, you can also just raise your hand and ask your question yourself. So most of you probably know about our organization, know about One Day Sooner already, but if you don't, we're an organization founded to advocate for human challenge trial volunteers. So there's 39,000 people now who are willing to be infected with the coronavirus to test a vaccine in order to speed up potential vaccine development. Less of a concern right now, which is great, but if for some reason there is a need or some point in the future, those are risks that we have decided we're willing to take. But we're very concerned, and we all very much feel that if we're going to take a risk, we want that benefit to be distributed evenly and equitably. So not even just equally, but we want it to be equitable, and that means in the United States, and it also means around the world. So just a preview of where we are as an organization. And in terms of these talks, we'll be doing more of them that especially deal with global issues, thinking about not just how the vaccine will be distributed equitably in the United States, but around the world, which is going to be an even longer process and will face a lot of similar challenges, in fact. The other dimension of this, of our work, is that we are certainly aware that we are that we're advocating for a controversial research, and that it has, one of the reasons it's controversial is because of a long history of abuses by the medical system, particularly obviously towards people of color. The number one issue or event that people always think about when they think about medical abuses is the United States Public Health Service syphilis study that took place from 1932 to 1972. I'm not sure if one of the panelists is going to discuss that more in depth. If not, we can get into it in the Q&A, because it certainly is a big issue that is coming up these days, comes up as shorthand for a lot of larger issues, which is a lot of what these panelists are going to be getting into. And so the point of this panel is exactly that the history of exploitation and this history of racial inequity includes, but is not limited to, that study or even to clinical research at all. So if we want to address any issues in public health, health equity, or medical research, we do have to confront specific and identifiable histories like that, but also histories that are much harder to sort of point a finger at, to identify specifically. So again, that including but not limited to part is a lot of what we're going to be talking about this evening, specifically in context of vaccines, but again, not just in terms of vaccines. And so, if you've been paying any attention to these, to conversations about vaccine hesitancy, some of that is often going to the anti-vaxxers who have been around for a long, for quite some time, resisting vaccines for a variety of reasons. But increasingly, people are also talking about this issue of trust among people of color and whether they will or will not take the vaccine. And so one of the big things that we'll be discussing is Dr. Warren, who's proposing this real paradigm shift. So instead of asking for the trust of Black people, he's arguing that medical systems and white people and all of these people in healthcare need to prove themselves trustworthy. So rather than placing the onus on Black people, there's another side to it. And there's something that that people in the medical system, and again, white people, have to work towards. They have to earn that trust. They have to prove themselves trustworthy. So as I said, there's three panelists here with us this evening. The first is Dr. Rueben Warren of Tuskegee University. And for those who may not know, Tuskegee is an HBCU, historically Black university in Alabama, founded by Booker T. Washington. It didn't run the infamous study, but it did become home to the National Center for Bioethics in Research and Healthcare, of which Dr. Warren is the director. And so the creation of that center was part of the 1997 apology issued by the federal government, issued by Bill Clinton, for the abuses of that study. Dr. Warren has many accomplishments, many publications, has worked with a number of organizations over his career. He's the former director of the Institute for Faith Health Leadership and adjunct professor of public health medicine and ethics at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta. He also worked at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and the National Institutes of Health. He holds a dental degree from Meharry College, Medical College, and earned his PhD from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He also has a dental degree and a divinity degree as well. And joining Dr. Warren are two emerging scholars who will certainly be shaping the future of these fields as we as a society sort of commit to equity and do this work in equity, again, bringing together sort of everybody in having these conversations and in doing this work. So Mr. Ashanti-ali Davis received his Master of Public Health degree at Tuskegee University. And Dara Richardson is a first-year student in the Master of Science in Public Health program at Meharry Medical College. Yeah, she's a first-year student there. And with that, I will pass it off to Dr. Warren, then followed by Mr. Davis, and then followed by Ms. Richardson.
Good afternoon. This is really an exciting opportunity, and I want to thank Dr. Rosenheck and all others who participated in developing this conversation. The most important thing about it, from my context, is that we're in conversation. I don't have to be right, I don't have to be wrong, but I have to be heard. And I've asked two of my junior colleagues to join in this conversation because they have to be heard. I said to both of them that I don't know what you think, but I know I need to hear it. So both of them have both the courage and the compassion to speak their own words, and I've encouraged them to do so. Let me start again by putting our conversation in context. This whole notion of health or the lack thereof has to be in a broader context than physical well-being or the lack thereof. So our conversation is framed around physical, social, psychological, and spiritual well-being of the individual and the group within the context of their social and physical environment. That's a long definition, description of health, but those are the dynamics you have to consider. And in that context, we find ourselves in a coronavirus pandemic. And some would say surprisingly so. I would say expectedly so. And in that context, I want to frame my words in about 7 minutes now in the experience of African Americans, because that's the context in which we have to talk about participating in human subject research, participating in clinical trials knowingly or unknowingly, and volunteering to do so, which is part of the conversation that we're having today. And in that context, historically, and last year we celebrated 400 years, 1619 to 2019, when the first Africans were brought to this country for the purpose of enslavement. Not the first time Africans have come to North America, but the first time we were able to talk about it in the context of enslavement. And so we came as a people here to contribute by whatever means necessary, and evolving from that notion of Black bodies to contribute to the growing and expanding of a country came the enslavement of that same group of people and the barbaric treatment that occurred during that time. And out of that came, well, these folk don't need to be enslaved, but they really are lesser than. They're really not fully human. So therefore, the things that we can do to enhance the well-being of fully human beings, they can help us do that, knowingly or unknowingly. And that's, we ushered from, or we transitioned from enslavement to what it was called the eugenics movement, which talked about a class struggle in Britain that says that certain folk were born genetically different. Some were superior and some were inferior. And that was based upon a class description. What we find in the US, it was enhanced by class, but also enhanced by race. That context leads us to the United States Public Health Service syphilis study at Tuskegee, which between 1932 and 1972, there was an experiment, they called it, to see the impact of syphilis on the human organ systems. They were intentional about that, not on human beings, but on human organ systems. And how do you get to a human organ system? You have to wait till the human is no longer there. So they studied the trajectory of this disease. And what they found in 1937, 38 was that there was a relationship between syphilis and organ systems. And so they found out what they wanted to know, so they should have stopped, but they didn't. So it continued on, and then some would argue that it continues as we speak. So that's kind of the backdrop to the notion of engaging in human subjects research and clinical trials, but in fact, clinical trials are part of the human subject research dynamic. So we're pushed to a framework of abuse, disadvantage, and asked folks, do you want to participate? Do you want to participate in clinical trials? In general, but specifically in clinical trials related to the coronavirus pandemic. And then do you want to volunteer to participate? So that has to be contextualized in a framework of those experiences. And I'm going to give you four bullets to frame our conversation. And the first is withholding information. In the US Public Health Service syphilis study, they not only withheld information, they withheld treatment. So they told the men that they were trying to help them because they had bad blood. Now, I'm a dentist. I've done a lot of work after that, but I never heard in the scientific literature the term called bad blood. So they told them that you got bad blood and we want to help you with your bad blood. Withheld information, treatment. So the first notion is withholding information, which in my context is unethical. The second was cultural insensitivity. And I'm being kind. I would call it more than that. It was blatant racism, cultural insensitivity. They chose not to be sensitive to the context, the experience of those men at that point in time. Remember, 1932, rural Southern Alabama, and that context with a group of people who were very trusting, very religious. So the cultural context, the cultural sensitivity was to use that cultural commitment to help others, to give to others. The religious context was right there in the South, right there in the rural South, particularly among Black people. So it wasn't that the men were ignorant, were dumb or were shifty, but they trusted. They trusted Northern federal scientists to do what was best for them. That's the second context. Cultural insensitivity is a kind word to put it. And deception. They said a lot of things that were untrue, and they knew they were untrue as they said them. And in that context, in 2020, as we struggle through the coronavirus pandemic, there are some things that have been said that are untrue. Not that we knew better and told and didn't do. We knew better and intentionally didn't do. So there was some deception, and not the evolution of science, but as we're finding through the public press, that many knew that the impact of the coronavirus pandemic was far greater and far wider than would ever want to admit. So there was a deception that was blatant then and blatant now. And the last and most importantly, and when it comes to clinical trials and being the first to take the vaccine, deception. What is it? How does it impact? Something as basic as there's this notion of emergency use approval, but you don't hear emergency use approval, you hear approval. There's something very different than emergency use approval, which simply says that we're going to use a therapeutic or a medical device for some that has been approved, but has not been approved for what we want to use it for. Or a medical device or a therapeutic that has not been approved, but because of the urgency, we're going to use it. Versus approval, which is a different kind of process. So what we have to contextualize this conversation around 4 bullets: withholding information, cultural insensitivity, deception, and exploitation. So as you hear the conversation, every time there is a news announcement, a blurb on the television, a scholar, a scientist, and critics, the word Tuskegee comes up every time. Tuskegee, they call it the experiment, which it was not. They call it the syphilis study, which it was not. They call it the Tuskegee syphilis study, which it was not. So all of those things confuse, and I would argue by intention, people to make the decision that's in their best interest. So as we have this conversation, as we listen to Mr. Davis, as we listen to Ms. Richardson, put those things in your mind. And what I've asked them to do is not to speak from a context of a scientist per se, of a scholar per se, even though they are, but from their context, their generation will make this better. And I'm anxious to hear their thoughts about what I've said. We need to take the vaccine. We need to be vaccinated. That is not the question. The empowering question is under what conditions and what assurances. So don't get into a discussion about should we be vaccinated, should we not be vaccinated. From my perspective, absolutely. That's one of the greatest public health interventions that's happened throughout the world. Under what conditions and what assurances. And I'm anxious Mr. Davis and Ms. Richardson talk about that from their context. It's really their generation that's going to make the difference in this country. And I hope that's a framework from which we can have a really full and healthy conversation. Thank you so much. Mr. Davis or Ms. Richardson.
I think I'll go. First, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to come speak. Going off of what Dr. Warren was speaking about is context. So for me to give my perspective, I must give the context of which I'm coming from. I'm 27 years old. I grew up in Stoughton, Massachusetts, which is about 30 minutes south of Boston, in a predominantly white community. And growing up, my parents made sure that I learned about the history of African Americans in the United States, but also before the Middle Passage transatlantic slave trade. So growing up, a lot of these injustices that some people are learning about today, I grew up knowing about. So I've had a couple of years to mull over it and think about it. And from there, I went to University of Massachusetts Amherst, where I got a bachelor's in science in molecular biology and biochemistry. And then from there, I went to Tuskegee University, where I got my master's in public health. And with knowing the history of what has happened to Black people in the United States, I had to wrestle with the dilemma of being in a field that has historically mistreated people that look like me. And what does it take for a field and a person to become trustworthy? Because some would argue that just because I'm Black, that I'm trustworthy. And I would argue that it takes more than just that. It takes the context of which someone is coming from. And then, so my perspective on with the coronavirus and vaccinations is that I think that at first we need to acknowledge that the history of racism goes very deep, in that a lot of the remnants of racism is what made what exposed the Black community to this disproportionate impact of coronavirus. Is that I've heard from some of my colleagues that they think that, oh, it might have been created or something like that, but I've had to explain to them that because of the systemic racism that exists in this country, that many communities were vulnerable to a pandemic. And with that is that with the rates that you're seeing in hospitalizations and deaths is a result of systemic racism. So speaking to another part of what Dr. Warren said is about exploitation. And through the 2 years that when I was at Tuskegee University, going through the literature and then following up to see what has the research produced, there are times that you'll see that communities are being exploited because they fit a demographic. And the researchers come in, they get the research that they need from the people, and then nothing comes to fruition from it. And that's one of the insurances I think that Dr. Warren is talking about, is that if I participate in this, what is the guarantee that I know that people that look like me are going to benefit from? And I think another thing is also just the policies surrounding people that, the individuals that choose to participate in clinical trials, because even if you do get someone who's Black, maybe from a lower income community, they participate in a clinical trial, they take the drug, they find out that the drug is effective, then that drug gets rolled out. Because of the other characteristics of that person, they aren't able to even access that drug. And that's one problem, is that I was able to get this treatment when I was in the study, but now I'll need it afterwards. I won't be able to access it. So that goes into the healthcare realm of, should healthcare be given to those that participate in a clinical trial just for that trial, or maybe for years after that trial, to make sure if there are any long-term side effects that they are taken care of. And personally, I think that there should be a universal healthcare system, so it's not on the responsibility of, I have to be in a clinical trial because I don't have healthcare. There's a couple more things up here, but I think the Q&A will get a little bit deeper into a lot of other things.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Dara Richardson, and I suppose, as Mr. Davis did, I should provide some context for the feedback that you all will be hearing from me today. I'm born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, in the South. I live in DeKalb County, which is a predominantly Black county in Georgia. So growing up, going to school, I've been surrounded by people who look like me. I went to Grambling State University in Grambling, Louisiana for my undergraduate degree. I got a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Grambling, which is also an HBCU. So my experience is much like Mr. Davis. I was taught about racial issues and racial injustices, and not to trust the system in a way. Be very cautious, be very mindful, do your own research, don't just take anything at face value. So I believe that now, during this time where information is so accessible and so universal, a lot of people are now becoming aware of things that people who grew up as a Black person in America probably already knew. Like on like the internet, on social media, you see things going around about racial injustices, you see things going on today, but you also hear about things that happened in the past that nobody seemed to know about. And whether you knew about it or not, that has shaped the culture and the way we view things in perspective of especially healthcare, trusting the government to provide accurate information to us, and just the knowledge that is mainstream is very much toned down. It's very sugar coated in a way. So we as a people, and I can speak for myself and people who are like me in my age range who grew up in a way that I did, we are already very cautious and very slow to take, I would say, advice or take information at face value from government institutions, regulatory agencies, people who are supposed to be in charge and you're supposed to be able to look up to them and trust them. We have to take that with a grain of salt, and we have to look back and see, is there an area where there could be an ulterior motive at play? So I am not cynical, but I'm very cautious with what I believe and what I take as fact. And I prefer to do my own research and gain my own insight into situations like this.
Thank you so much to all of you guys for your comments. So as I said, if people have questions, you can either just raise your hand with the hand raise function, or you can throw a comment in the chat and I will read it out loud. And I'm also happy to start off with a question, which is really for all of you, although it's building off of what Ms. Richardson just said. So how do you make decisions as both a scientist and someone who knows to mistrust, or knows to, mistrust maybe a loaded word, but knows has been raised the way you have to treat the system the way that you do?
Well, going off of what Ms. Richardson said, is that now, since I have my MPH, is that I have the tools to actually critique certain literature, and also look at the methodology and see whether or not it's something that I would want to participate in. For example, I looked at the numbers for the Pfizer vaccine, and when they had the numbers for the number of participants in the United States, it was, I think it was 10% African American or Black, and 10% African American or Black. We make up 13% of the population. However, also based off of the numbers from the CDC, we are disproportionately affected in terms of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. So, and the purpose of clinical trials is that you're supposed to have people, the population is supposed to represent those who will be taking it, those who will be taking it. So looking at that, is that made me a little bit hesitant about the validity of the population sampling. And I think one thing that going through the MPH program is that it taught me is that, well, before I've always trusted the science, but who I don't trust is a scientist. And that goes into what Dr. Warren was talking about the deception, suppressing data. And I think the charge of our generation is that, how are we going to address the distrust for the scientists?
Do you have any answers as to how you build the trust with the scientists?
It's a work in progress. But I think that just like I said before, in terms of people participating in clinical trials, I think that one thing that can definitely help with the assurances that some people will have is the access to healthcare. Because from talking to some of my contemporaries and some of my colleagues, is that one of their hesitations to taking the vaccine is that, okay, I might not have an adverse reaction right then when they give it to me, not in the next month, but what about maybe 2-3 years down the line? We've all seen those commercials that if you've taken something in the past 5 years, you're entitled to. So that's where some of their concerns are, is that it's not the immediate, but it's the long-term effects that they're worried about. And some of the people that I spoke to is that they don't have health insurance. So they literally cannot afford to get sick.
One of the things that I said to Mr. Davis and also Ms. Richardson, how do you trust the scientists, particularly the public health scientists? Become one.
All right, our next question is, Dr. Warren offered that the healthcare industry needs to work towards building trust with minority communities. Can you share some thoughts about strategies to build trust?
Yeah, I think the notion is not to build trust, but to prove yourself trustworthy. Different paradigm. So if you prove yourself trustworthy, trust will come, I believe. What are some of the ways to prove yourself trustworthy? One is putting in the time, engaging communities before you need something. Engage in communities before you need something, not when you need something. You've heard the notion of helicopter researchers, helicopter in, collect the data, and helicopter out. So you got to put in the time and be engaged in something beyond what your specific concern is. Learn to listen more than to talk. We've done some work with the environmental justice community for many, many years, and we've constructed what we're calling listening sessions, where you go in listening rather than with the answer. So learn more than you talk. Build trustworthiness that precedes trust is the way that you do that. And how to do that, that's agenda that's to unfold. But I know it starts with time and integrity and honesty.
Do you think the COVID crisis is laying any useful foundations for that?
I think it's doing all the wrong things for that. I think as it started, first we were told by CDC and others that we don't have the data, the racial and ethnic breakdown. That's not true. I spent 20 years, they had the data. And then with press, they said what the data said, but it wasn't surprising. Anybody that's working in the field of public health or general in health, and if they were surprised by what the data say about the coronavirus, they were dishonest or very naive. So we knew what it was going to say. We just needed to collect the data to report it.
And I might to add something to that. Suppression of factual data is not helpful to building a trusting relationship between government and citizens, public health practitioners, and the community. It does more harm than good. And the data is not going to lie, but the people reporting it might. And that's just where the trust kind of breaks down, because there's really no reason to lie unless there is an ulterior motive at play. If you're trying to suppress information, then it becomes obvious when the information then comes out and we see what it really says. If you're trying to convince people that, oh, you're fine, you won't get sick, you don't need to wear a mask, but then all this data comes out that, oh, actually wearing a mask is actually helpful. We knew that already. we knew that already. So it's no reason to be hiding this information unless you just wanted a certain population to be more vulnerable than others.
I have another question for Ms. Richardson. So what would you suggest people say specifically to public health students, particularly to MPH students, about the COVID-19 vaccination?
What do I think they should say to public health students? Well, as a public health student, I guess I'm qualified to answer this question. Honestly, the truth, really just the truth. It gets, it's too much when you're trying to wrap things up in a nice little package and say, oh, it's so effective, it's no issues with it. We know that that's not the case, but we just need to know how effective it really is in a real life scenario, in a population that is representative of the actual population, and people who are most vulnerable to getting coronavirus and therefore are in most need of the vaccination. We just have to be upfront to public health students about what is it that we need to do? What do we need to know to equip ourselves to go out and to share with our communities that, okay, these are the facts. The vaccination is effective in this way, and we don't know the long-term implications of the vaccination or of coronavirus infection. So it's just, the truth needs to be laid out and it needs to be very plain, and people can determine whether or not they're saying, oh, okay, well, that's fine with me, or that's not fine with me. And it's up to each individual to make that decision for themselves. And as public health students, if we did not already know, we are learning the importance of population health, herd immunity, and things like that. So we understand that it's necessary and that it's needed in some capacity, but you can't lie to people just because you want them to take the vaccine, because eventually the truth will come forward. And now we have another breakdown of the trust in the communication.
So the next question is, how do you think recent social justice movement have impacted the COVID-19 vaccine discussion with racial and ethnic communities? And I'll sort of emphasize the vaccine part, because I think we've heard not everything there is to say, but we've heard a little bit more about the intersections with COVID generally. So since the vaccines are coming up right now, I'll emphasize that part of the question.
Well, I think that with the social justice movement intersecting also with the technology that we have, is that information is readily available now. And and with a lot of the social justice movement, there are people that might not have, well, there are Black people that might not have learned the good, bad, and ugly history of what has happened in the United States. And through social media and things like that, they're learning more and more. And realistically, that might be driving some of the mistrust, because if this is new information for you, then that's something that's fresh in your mind. And then this medical field is then coming to you asking you to participate or take this vaccine. It's going to be very hard to convince someone who just learned about Henrietta Lacks, just learned about J. Marion Sims, the father of gynecology, what he actually did and how he used Black women, enslaved Black women for his experimentation, or how about how the medical schools were grave robbing Black cemeteries for cadavers for their medical students. Like, learning that will create a type of mistrust, but I think it's on the onus of the institutions, if they are trustworthy, to present facts that have shown that they have been moving the needle forward to not let those types of injustices happen. So it's time and history. And if you don't have the history to support your claims, then it's hard for you to be trustworthy and people to trust you.
From my perspective, social justice and public health, and so the social justice movement, beyond one's physical well-being, is consistent with public health. So I'm excited that it's moving, and what we have to do is synergize those constructs of public health into that movement, in opposed to seeing them as being separate. So you can't separate and then be cautious. Black Lives Matters and how that expanded throughout the world. Folks protested, folks gathered, but the important construct is do it in the best safe way possible. So it's not an either or, it's both and. Social justice and public health are quite the same, inseparable.
So there's a line actually from Dr. Warren's article in the JEMEP from last year, where he says that racial and ethnic minorities should not be considered inherently mistrustful. And I'm curious about how you guys think that idea is playing out in the conversation today, particularly thinking about how we're hearing a lot about how there's, an article every day about how Black people are not going to take the vaccine, and a poll every day. And I wonder how you think that has anything to do with that idea that Black people are assumed to be mistrustful.
Yeah, I think the first false notion, Black people are all the same, and that African American and Black are synonymous, which is a false notion. Black is a race description. African American is an ethnicity, and you've got different ethnic groups within the Black population, not only here, but around the world. So what you've got to do is understand the diversity of the African American or the Black population, and then begin to synergize the reasons why. The social context, the educational experience, the lived experience are very different. So anyone who talks about the Black population as being synonymous, I think is being naive. There's much in common because of the common experience, but there are also some major differences that create a difference of opinion. I think we ought to consider those as well.
I would like to say something about that. Like you said, that it's like a poll every day saying that Black people won't take the vaccine. I can't say that that's true or false, but I can say that that is based on something historical that people, whoever is having this opinion or stating this, they recognize that it is the historical basis and is based on something that's very real. And so they're not just saying that for no reason, although it's not accurate for everybody. There is a basis for that statement. So we have to understand that, like Dr. Warren said, not everybody is the same. Not all Black people are the same. So it needs to be addressed on a smaller population basis than just all the Black people in America, because there are a lot of us. So you can't say that one opinion fits everybody. I know for a fact that my grandparents and my older relatives would love to take the vaccine if it means that they don't have to worry about wearing a mask and staying in their house and not seeing anybody all day. So meanwhile, the younger population, they might not care. I care, but other people who are younger than me, they might not care because they don't feel like they're at such a risk as everybody else. But it's not fair to put that on everybody in the Black community. So, but I do understand where that sentiment comes from.
Yeah, no, thank you for that response. I think it does really speak to how those polls are coming out, and they're coming out as if they're truth when they're pretty minimal in terms of what they reveal, or limited in what they reveal. All right, folks, keep questions coming. I mean, I can ask questions all day, but please keep questions coming. So one question that I had that I would love for all of you actually to elaborate on is, what do you think the generational differences are in terms of, mostly in terms of attitudes towards sort of medicine and healthcare systems?
Some of the work that we've done around clinical trials in the African American community suggests that younger generations tend to distrust the system, and older generations tend to distrust the individuals because of a bad experience. So it's a different reason for the distrust, but nonetheless, it's there. So the intergenerational difference has a similar foundation, but for different reasons.
Well, to go off of what Dr. Warren said is that I guess that makes sense to me, is because with our generation is that, again, with all the information that we have at our fingertips, is that I guess we're looking at it more so as not an isolated incident, because a lot of times we'd be like, oh, that's just one individual that did that. But then when you take a step back and look at the history, it's like, no, it's the system that's the problem. It's not individuals. So even if you have the right individual in a bad system, you're still going to get a bad outcome. So I think, especially with my generation and hopefully younger generations, is that we're, with the distrust that we have for the system, that will force a revamp of that system.
I completely agree with what Mr. Davis said. As a, I guess, younger generation, on the cusp of the youngest generation, it's very true. It's true what Dr. Warren said. We recognize the linking of everything, how everything plays into each other. So you see how, for example, like the FDA. Now, I've been doing my own research on different things. So I know about some different, corrupt things going on in different regulatory agencies. And you see how that plays into the vaccinations that are approved. You see how that plays into different medications that are approved. So, and then the physicians, the hospitals, they'll push these medications because in a sense they are effective, but they don't worry about the further implications. They just, it's the big pharma, which is a thing. We know how all of those things play together, and we see it for what it is. So you can't really separate it. So it makes us, I'll say us as people like me, generally distrustful of the healthcare system, which is already skewed beyond belief and really needs a major revamp in and of itself. But we see how that has affected not only us, but our parents and our grandparents back in history, even though I think since we have so much access to different information, our scope is a lot bigger than even our parents or grandparents got to see. So they had books, they had encyclopedias, they had libraries, but you can't read every book in the library, and not all the information will be published and easily accessible. Now we have people who they don't have any ties to an organization which they are in effect exposing for what they're doing, and mistrust, reasons to mistrust, sources of corruption. They don't have any reason to hide anything or to try to gloss over anything. So we're getting things very raw and very real. So our scope is a lot greater, and we get to see how things are happening in the United States versus in the United Kingdom versus in Uganda versus in China. So we're able to put things into perspective and say, okay, well, how does Canada have this free healthcare, but we don't? And things like that. So I just think that that does play a really big role in our perspective and how we may or may not choose to have a certain level of trust in the healthcare system and in the government.
All right, Dr. Warren has a question for Mr. Davis and Ms. Richardson, which was on my list too. What are your hopes for the future? And actually, I think this actually follows into the next question as well. I can ask the next question a little more specifically, but like, how do you remake these systems?
Well, I think it's first making room so that everyone has a chance to be heard and everyone has a seat at the table. Because if they're, I'll give an example, with the legislation that's written about like abortions and things like that. It's like it's written by men, so you're not having women give their input or even lead the conversation about reproductive rights and things like that. So when you're trying to revamp a system so that it's racially equitable, is that you need people from these marginalized communities, especially African Americans, who have been subjected to a long history of mistreatment. So something that a white physician might miss, a Black physician might pick up and just say, "Oh, this is what this person means when they say this," or these are some of the barriers in which people within my community are facing in this system. Because it's hard for you to make a system for a community in which you never lived in which you have minimal interaction with. So I think it's having many different voices be heard, but not just heard, but respected and listened to. Because if you only just give them a space to talk and no real tangible action comes out of that, then it's just gonna keep the machine moving.
And what about hopes for the future to both Ms. Richardson and Mr. Davis?
Ms. Richardson, I'll let you take this one.
Okay, well, in terms of hopes for the future, that's a loaded question. My hopes for the future is that we can have a healthcare system that is accessible to everybody, not just the upper class, not just people who can afford to take a ride in an ambulance, not just for those people who can, when they stub their toe, they can have a doctor come to see them. My hope for the future is that everybody can access healthcare equally and everyone can have a solid relationship with the people who are providing their healthcare and who are providing them not just healthcare, but who are leading their communities and the people who are governing them, who are making laws for them. I think everybody needs to be heard, like Mr. Davis said, not just heard, but actions need to be taken from what they say. It needs to be a sincere dialogue, and problems need to be addressed in a way that is productive and not just inflammatory. Because as we saw over the summer with the Black Lives Matter movement, things were very inflammatory, but there wasn't much work being done to solve any of these issues. It was just like, for example, on social media, you learn about this injustice and this injustice and this injustice every day, and you're riled up and you're angry, but what does that do? So we need to have a system that does something with the information that is brought up, that we give it. So like Mr. Davis said, there really needs to be a change in how we address these problems. We need to listen to the people who are experiencing the problems, not just the people who are observing the problems happen to other people, because they don't truly know the impacts that has. I can say, for example, that I see what has happened to the Native Americans and how their historic water source and a source of water that they have revered and that means something to their community. I can say I see that. It's a problem. They need access to their water. They need the rights to their water, but only they can really share how that impacts them on a deeper level as a community, their spiritual life. So it needs to be put into perspective from each and every group that is affected, we need to hear from them and know, and they need to know that they won't just be a voice calling out into the abyss, but it will be some action taken to better their situation. And yeah, that's essentially what I would hope for the future.
And I get back to, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Also, and I guess, so I have two things I hope for the future is that with revamping the healthcare system is that we actually have a healthcare system and not a sick care system. Because in the United States is the best place for you to get sick. It's not necessarily the best place for you to be healthy. A lot of the healthcare system is reactionary. It's if you go into your doctor, you go to see if something's wrong, and then he doesn't. And physical, nothing's wrong. Come back when something's wrong. So I think it's about changing the paradigm to policies and laws that actually promote health. And the second part is in terms of like clinical trials is that for the future, I would want people to, well, everyone, but particularly Black people, to have the knowledge to make informed decisions about whether they want to engage in clinical trials, and then also have the autonomy to say under what conditions, and have those requests be seriously met.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. Well, so what do you guys think of ethics boards as they stand today in terms of clinical trials? Yeah, I don't know how much Ms. Richardson or Mr. Davis has studied clinical trials or clinical research, but I'm curious what you think of sort of the ethics process and how people are able to give informed consent and how that process works.
Well, I've actually successfully got a IRB application accepted, so going through that was rigorous. But I think that for the criteria that they have now, it's effective in stopping the past injustices from happening again. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily like forward thinking into being more preventative of different types of injustices occurring. So I think that it serves the purpose for which it was created, to make sure that the injustices don't happen again. But I think that more needs to be done to ensure that future injustices don't happen. Is that we don't need to be living in a reactionary type of ethics or healthcare system.
What do you think of the section that goes over the Tuskegee study? Do they still have that on there?
Yes.
Yes, they did. Okay, it's been a little bit since I read it.
It's like in the section where you have to go on the computer and you have to take a quiz. Like the first part is learning about that.
They always put it on there.
Well, what do you think about it, Dr. Warren?
I think it's important that they put it on there, but they ought to get it right. You see, it's on there, but what does that mean? You see, and that's important, because really the U.S. Public Health Service syphilis study is a metaphor for injustice. And so we need to explore that so we don't focus only on that, but it's a principle that needs to be. I'm convinced that you start, in terms of ethics, you start with a place, and then you go to the people, and then the principle. When you get to the principle, it's generalizable around the universe.
For those who haven't gone through the IRB, gone through the process of getting anything approved through the IRB, like the first section of the quiz that you have to take, where they assess whether you know how to be ethical or not.
Right.
It's a page about the history of I think it also includes the Nuremberg Code as well.
Exactly.
But it's like, a quiz, is this ethical or not? And as a historian, I'm always interested in that section because it's this little bit of history, but it doesn't really get us that far.
Right.
That was an aside for those who've gone through that process. Actually, the next question, I will get back to the education question here, but I'm curious to, actually this could go to all three of you, about how you got into public health specifically. So I know Dr. Warren, you went to dental school, I think first, but particularly for Mr. Davis and Ms. Richardson, you know, why not go to medical school? Why was public health your choice? And then, yeah, are you planning to go? I know Mr. Davis is planning to go on to a PhD, or is hoping to do so. So I'm curious about where you came from in terms of going to those degrees and where you want to go with them.
Well, I actually did consider medical school when I was a freshman in undergrad. I was pre-med, and then I took a couple of biochemistry classes, and then that's where I transferred my major to. And from there, I actually wanted to go into vaccine development. Vaccines for specifically looking at the 7 neglected tropical diseases. So that's what I wanted to go into. And then with further conversation with people within the pharmaceutical field, and then also just people within the medical field, is that there are effective treatments, but it's not the treatments that are the problem, it's the access to those treatments and the methods in which how those treatments are dispersed. So from there, that kind of led me into public health. And then when I was in Tuskegee, my focus was looking at food deserts and food insecurity, and then the relationship between that and oral and systemic health. And then from there, I've kind of evolved into policy pursuit, because a lot of the programs that are used to combat food insecurity and food deserts is that all it takes is a stroke of a pen, and there goes the budget for like SNAP or WIC. And we've seen that within the current pandemic, is that with depleting resources, is that people aren't having enough to eat. So, and that can further is actually any other type of ailments you'll have. So that's how I got into public health, and that's where I plan on going, is that into policy and ethics, definitely ethics.
And Ms. Rich?
For me, how did I get into public health? Well, initially, I wanted to be a veterinarian. I just knew I was going to go to vet school all throughout college. And it just, as I started to think about what my veterinary career looked like, it didn't really appeal to me in the way that I first thought it would. And so I wanted to make a greater impact on my community and the population as a whole. And what better way to do that than to go into public health? And of course, I had a birdie whispering in my ear, who is my mom. She is the dean of a public health program. So she was kind of just sharing, it's a good idea, you could do this. So I considered it, and I started to just think about the different things that I could do with that. And I do want to pursue a PhD after I get this degree, but I want to ultimately go into either policy or like regulation, something where I know I can have an impact, a widespread impact. And yeah, that's really how I got into public health. And I'm very interested in like studying health disparities. Most recently in my research design class, I did a paper on African American maternal mortality. And if you all are not familiar with it, that's a very pressing issue for African Americans. And I won't get into the nitty-gritty details, but it's a historic issue that goes all the way back to slavery. So that's really why I came into public health and the ultimate impact that I want to have.
Yeah, I think that's optimism for the future with these two. I'll go back a second and say, and so there was a question about the role of education in changing these systems of inequality. And I'm not exactly sure which systems of education that was referencing. So, you might think about, I think we can think about that at all the way down to the high school level in terms of thinking about, both of you, Ms. Richardson and Mr. Davis, talked about what you learned at home about race and racism and about African-American history. So yeah, again, you can probably answer the question about the impact of education all the way down from that level, all the way up to, college and even beyond, about how we learn about health systems and how we learn about racism there.
So for myself, I can say that growing up in the American education system, I have been in private school and public school, but throughout throughout middle school and high school, I was in a semi-public school. We got regular education that everybody else gets, and they don't tell you about the real racial disparities that are going on in the healthcare system. They just kind of gloss over it. They make it that you get the bare minimum. You just get the bare bones of what it is supposed to do, what it should be doing, but not necessarily what it is doing and what it is effective at doing. But going to an HBCU changed my perspective, because at my school, and I'm not sure if Mr. Davis would agree, but having Black professors who understand and who have a shared experience with students who look like me, they are able to put it into perspective and say, well, these things occurred, so you need to be aware of these things going forward, and as you matriculate and as you grow up into an adult and go about your life. So I can't really say that the education system, K through 12, has necessarily done anything to foster the development of critical thinking in terms of how it relates to the healthcare system and trustworthiness of doctors and all these, different things. I can't really say that has done anything. My parents and my college professors did more to that effect than did the just regular education system, which, I mean, I can't fault them for it. It's just the curriculum. They don't necessarily care, because they're teaching to the majority. They're not teaching to in a way that is geared towards minorities and geared towards protecting us, or letting us know different precautions we should take, or how to be cautious and how to think about such things in a perspective of how will this affect me? How will this affect generations coming after me? They just, you go to the doctor when you're sick, like Mr. Davis said, you go when you're sick. When you're doing fine, you just go about your business. So yeah, that's what I had to say about the education system.
So I agree with Ms. Richardson, is that with the education system, so for high school, I went to a public, 2 years to public and 2 years to a private school. And in neither one of those schools did I learn about the true racial history of the United States. A lot of it was maybe, oh, there was a transatlantic slave trade, then there was Civil War, Jim Crow, Martin Luther King, and then everyone's friends. So that was pretty much the crux of the racial education for the United States. But from the education I got at home, is that I knew that there was a couple more pages in between those milestones. So I think one thing, especially with the education system, where they can look to another country, and that country still has its problems, but South Africa, with South Africa is that they had no problem they addressed what they did and who was involved in everything about apartheid and everything before that. And I think especially with here in the United States is that people don't want to talk about who did what and for how long and the reasons behind it. Like one thing that I, within a psychology class, I explained to my teacher at UMass Amherst about like the racial, like how racism even permeated into psychology. One of the examples I gave is that enslaved Africans would be diagnosed with a mental illness for escaping freedom. They wrote it down and said, this is a mental illness. So just having the in-depth knowledge to identify where racism and bigotry have permeated into all facets that touch our lives, because I think it extends much bigger than the public health sphere.
So yeah, other people are still more than welcome to ask questions, although I am happy to continue. So what do you think about health classes in high school? I always ask the history question because I'm a historian by training. And so I'm always interested in exactly what you're talking about what we don't learn in history classes and all of that kind of stuff. But when Ms. Richardson was talking, I started thinking a little bit more about health classes as another site in which these conversations might happen at that high school level. So I'm curious if you guys have experiences or thoughts about whether that's a useful space to start some of these conversations or impart information.
Well, let's see, when did I take health? Freshman and sophomore year of high school. My health class was taught by the gym teacher and the football coach. So I don't really have trust that he was very knowledgeable about health and talking about sexual health, talking about all the other diet, exercise. We watched a lot of movies since he was a football coach. We had to watch Rudy and Remember the Titans. So that consisted of my health class. So I think it's about definitely having the budget for and getting qualified teachers to teach health and asking the students, what does health mean to them? I know that in Dr. Warren's classes that he asked that, and I think for some of my colleagues, that's the first time that they were ever asked, like, what exactly is health to you? Is it a journey or is it a destination? And well, I mean, Dr. Warren, would you like to talk about that concept?
You can do it.
Okay. So when people say they want to be healthy, you then need to ask what for, because health within itself is not the end goal. You want to be healthy to do something. Some people, I know, like my father, he had knee surgery, so he wants to be healthy so that he can go back to training because he does martial arts. So it's not health within itself, it's what you can do with health. Is that health is the journey to get to where you want to be. And within that is that you need to do things that promote promote your health and promote you being able, the capability of you to do those things.
Perfect.
Okay.
So I must agree with Mr. Davis again. I had my high school schedule was set up the first semester of the year, you do physical education. The second semester, the same gym teacher teaches you health. And you have the book and you learn about nutrition, you learn about exercise. You need to exercise for 30 minutes and make sure you break a sweat. You learn about, oh, it's important to have to play sports and have physical hobbies and be flexible and things like that. And you learn about sex ed and STDs, and you get the graphic pictures, and everybody's just like, okay. And so that's pretty much it. We did watch Super Size Me, which that was informative. It let me know not to eat fast food. So I guess I got something good out of it, but it has nothing to do with health care in the United States. It's just about how to make yourself healthy, but there's nothing about the system that you fall back on if you are not healthy. So I think that's maybe some room for improvement in the health curriculum being taught to high school students in particular. I'm not exactly sure how they should address it. If they should say, maybe talk about different specialty doctors, talk about what you would go to this doctor for, what constitutes an emergency situation versus just get the first aid kit at home. We don't learn about those things. Those are just things that you learn throughout life. And especially in college, if you get a paper cut, you put a Band-Aid on it. If you break a leg, you drive yourself to the emergency room because you can't afford an ambulance as a college student. So, you just learn to work it out. And high school did not teach me about any of those things.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's not a question I'd ever thought about until you started talking, but it's actually, I think it's part of what's going on in this pandemic is that it's hard to know what resources you have. It's sort of, it's raising all these questions about health. And I was going to say, one of the other things that I think has come up in this conversation about clinical trials is knowing what questions to ask, both when you go to the doctor and then also especially, and then even more so when you're thinking about medical research. Is certainly something that is an important skill that I don't know if health classes, health classes could certainly teach.
And I think that's what you said is definitely important, is knowing what questions to ask, because someone in my family, I actually spoke with them 2 days ago, informed me that she was participating in a trial, but it's more so of an observation where it's just looking at taking blood and looking at the antibodies and things like that. And I asked her, I said, what made you feel comfortable participating? And her response was that I felt comfortable that I had enough knowledge to know what questions to ask so that they wouldn't be able to take advantage of me.
Yeah, and I think it happens with when you're sick, and it's not a sick that you're familiar with. I think it comes up then as well, at least it has for me. So there's another question about what about biology class? Is that somewhere that we can learn more about some of these things about race and health than we do?
No. From my experience,
I agree. No.
I did not learn about health care, health equity, and biology. I did learn about cells. I learned about biological systems. I learned about how my body works. I learned about animal cells. I learned about plant cells. I did not learn about healthcare in a meaningful way that will be applicable to my life as just a regular person, not as a person with a biology degree. Of course, that those things were important to me and helped my knowledge in school, but that's not really applicable in my daily life.
I think maybe some of the things that you learn in biology, if you had a class that integrated a lot of the different subjects that you learn, then it would be beneficial, because if you are having a conversation about race, biology does play a role in it. You have to talk about, it's like, okay, what is the biological factors that makes my skin the way it looks that it is versus someone else's, and then from there you can have an in-depth conversations like, is it a real thing? Is it a social construct? Is it something that is legitimate to put value on, which it isn't. But I think with that, you can also, having that conversation at a young age, is that those that go on to become doctors, scientists, and things like that, is that they're able to engage with those types of problems in a meaningful way, because it's not the first time that they're being confronted with it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say I agree. And I, as a biology student, I had to take several like upper level courses in biology, like cellular and molecular biology. And in that class, I learned about different genetic expressions. And I learned that we really all have the same genetic makeup. It's just about how our genes are expressed that makes us different. And maybe it's just that the people who are developing the curriculum, maybe they don't think that it's worth going into because it's such a complex topic to get into, especially for 12-year-olds in ninth grade. So I understand that why they wouldn't want to go so far in depth, but there is value in starting that early, and so that you already have that knowledge and you're not thinking, oh, I am the superior genetic race. And then in college you find out, oh, I'm not. But then there's the ego involved and you're like, well, that can't be right. No, there's something wrong about that. And so then it translates when you have doctors who think that Black people have a higher pain tolerance because they're different, even though you just learned not too many years ago that we're not different, but you grew up all those years thinking that we were different. So it's ingrained in your mind already. And it takes a lot more effort to tear that down rather than it takes to build it up the correct way.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck when you said that in biology class you learn how your body works, and yet somehow that doesn't translate to health. And like, I totally understand it doesn't, but it's striking that it's such a rich opportunity to, to bring health into, part of our conversation, part of our everyday lives, that doesn't happen because of the curriculum, because it's textbooks.
And then I would also just say that when we are having the conversation about race, especially in the context of the medical field, clinical trials and things like that, is that we need to not be hesitant to have that conversation, because I'll give an example with, I think it was the Human Genome Project, is that they found that with the samples that they have, is that it was predominantly from white men, that there was a lack of diversity within that. So now I think it's called All of Us.
That's right.
Okay, so now it's getting more diversity within the gene pool. And the reason for that is that they found that a genetic marker for someone that might come from a European background that would be considered as white has a different marker for an increase in heart disease that a Black person will have, but that isn't associated with a higher risk. So I think when we're having a conversation about race, is that we need to, especially in the medical field, is that understand that there are distinctions, but those distinctions do not validate a judgment or evaluation on that person.
All right, we're coming up on the end of time, so I'll give everybody a chance to give us your final thoughts. If you can give them on. We've had a pretty wide-ranging conversation, which has been really great, and hopefully my questions have been good. And people have mostly stuck around, though I know that's not for me. I know that's for you guys because you're brilliant, and this has been a really rich conversation. So yeah, final thoughts from everyone before we sign off for the evening.
Ms. Richardson, do you want to start first and we'll go in reverse?
Sure. Final thoughts. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you for even extending this opportunity for me and letting my voice be heard. It makes me feel really good. And I just want people to take away from this, consider these things when you see social issues and public health issues on the news. just think about how different communities are impacted disproportionately from maybe your own community, and just try to put things into perspective, take a walk in somebody else's shoes, as they say, and don't just think about how you would react to something, and just consider how other people feel and other people's lived experiences that may contribute to the way that they perceive something or their attitudes towards anything in particular. And I just want to thank everybody for hearing me out.
Well, I guess mine's going to be a little bit short, but I guess I'll take a line from Dr. Warren, is ask the empowering questions. And you might not have immediately the answer, but as long as you raise them, then those who are in a position of power cannot act as though that they didn't know. So when people know better, hopefully they do better. But if they don't, then it is the responsibility of the public to hold them accountable. And I think there's a quote that I want to leave with that says, I'd rather have questions I can't answer than answers I can't question.
Mr. Davis sounded like an ethicist. It's an important thing. And let me close by, Dr. Rosenheck, thank you for engaging us. And we really worked through this whole session together for a couple of months. And that's what I think is really, really good. And last and most importantly, future is powerful when you hear young Black folk express their interests, their concerns with authority. And I'm okay for tomorrow, because I know tomorrow's in good hands. So thank you both for participating. You made us proud.
Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. As much as I love hearing the senior scholars, I really love hearing from the graduate students too. So
Absolutely.
Thank you, everybody. I'll send an email through the Eventbrite thing with the link to the YouTube event, so you can share that in case anybody didn't make it. So once again, thank you so much, panelists, for joining us, and everyone in the audience for joining us as well.
Thank you.